kept a Bigfoot locked in a concrete cage for 50 years, and when the military finally discovered what I'd done, they didn't arrest me for the cruelty. They thanked me for the specimen. Some people will call me a monster for admitting this, and they'd be right. But after 5 decades of living with this secret, watching what my cowardice set in motion, I believe the world needs to know the truth about what happens when fear makes your decisions for you. My name is Robert Caldwell. I'm 82 years old, and I'm a former logging camp foreman from Humboldt County, California. This is my confession, and I need to tell it exactly as it happened, because what I learned about myself, about government secrets, and about the cost of silence will haunt me until the day I die. The summer of 1974 was oppressively hot in Northern California. I was 34 years old, recently promoted to foreman at a mid-sized logging operation, and still reeling from my father's sudden death that spring. He'd left me 240 acres of dense redwood forest about 30 miles inland from Eureka, land that had been in our family since the 1920s. The property was isolated, accessible only by a single dirt road that turned to mud every winter, surrounded by thousands of acres of old-growth forest that seemed to swallow sound itself. I'd hired a small crew, just 3 men, to help me clear some of the old logging roads my father had let grow over. We needed access to evaluate the timber, see what was salvageable, what was worth keeping. It was supposed to be simple work. Cut back the brush, grade the roads, maybe take down a few problem trees. Nothing we hadn't done 100 times before. It was July 23rd, around 2:30 in the afternoon, when everything changed. We were working on a steep section of road that ran along a natural ravine, maybe 15 feet deep, thick with ferns and blackberry tangles at the bottom. My operator, a guy named Dave Hutchins, was using a small bulldozer to push debris off the road edge when the ground just gave way. The entire shoulder collapsed, decades of root systems finally failing, sending maybe 2 tons of soil and rock cascading into the ravine below. We heard the sound immediately, not an animal sound I recognized, not a bear or cougar, something else entirely. A vocalization that was almost human, but not quite, high-pitched and terrified, coming from beneath the rubble. Dave killed the engine. We all stood there, listening. Then we heard thrashing, desperate movement, and something that sounded disturbingly like crying. I grabbed a shovel and climbed down into the ravine, my boots sinking into the soft earth. The other men followed. We started clearing rocks and soil, and that's when I saw it. A hand, massive and covered in dark reddish-brown hair, with fingers at least 7 inches long and what looked like fingernails, not claws. My heart stopped. Every rational thought in my head tried to make it something else, a bear paw, a person in a costume, anything but what it obviously was, a Bigfoot. Young, maybe 6 feet tall, significantly smaller than the stories always described. Its left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken from the rockfall. It was breathing rapidly, chest heaving, eyes wide with pain and terror. Those eyes, dark brown and completely horrifyingly intelligent, locked onto mine. It knew exactly what we were. It knew exactly what danger it was in. Dave stumbled backward, actually fell on his ass. "Jesus Christ," he kept saying. "Jesus Christ, Bob, what is that?" The other 2 men, Tommy and Ray, just stood there frozen, shovels hanging limp in their hands. Nobody moved. The creature tried to pull itself away from us, dragging its broken leg, making sounds that I can still hear in my nightmares, half growl, half whimper, entirely pain. "We need to kill it," Tommy said finally, his voice shaking. "We need to kill it right now before it attacks us." Ray nodded, already reaching for the rifle we kept in the truck for bears. But I held up my hand, my mind racing through possibilities I couldn't quite articulate yet. This was real. This was proof of something the world said didn't exist. This was worth something, had to be worth something. "Nobody's shooting anything," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "It's injured." "It's not going anywhere." I climbed back up to my truck and grabbed the veterinary tranquilizer kit I kept for dealing with aggressive bears near logging sites. My hands were shaking as I loaded the dart, measuring out what I guessed might work for something this size. I had no idea what I was doing, just estimating based on body weight and praying I wouldn't kill it. The dart hit its shoulder. The creature made that terrible sound again, tried to pull the dart out with its good hand, but the sedative was already working. Within 3 minutes, its movement slowed. Within 5, it slumped against the ravine wall, chest still rising and falling, but unconscious. "What are you doing, Bob?" Dave asked quietly. I didn't answer because I didn't know yet. We rigged a tarp as a stretcher and hauled it up out of the ravine, all 4 of us straining under the weight. Even young and injured, it must have weighed 350 pounds. We loaded it into the bed of my pickup truck, covered it with more tarps, and I drove it back to my property while the crew followed in their vehicles. My father had been paranoid. A Cold War veteran who'd built a concrete storage bunker on the property back in 1957, convinced nuclear war was imminent. It was half buried in a hillside, reinforced walls 2 feet thick, a heavy steel door that locked from the outside. Inside was a single room, maybe 12 by 12 feet, with a drain in the floor and nothing else. I'd used it for storage, old equipment and supplies. Now I cleared it out in 20 frantic minutes while the creature lay unconscious in my truck. We dragged it inside, secured the door. I told the crew that the thing had died from its injuries, that we'd buried it deep in the woods where nobody would find it. I paid each of them $500 in cash, 3 months' wages for a single day's work, and told them if they ever spoke about this, if anyone ever came asking questions, they'd seen nothing but a sick bear that we put down. They took the money, they left. And I stood alone outside that bunker door, listening to the sounds of the creature beginning to wake up inside. I told myself it was temporary. Just a few days until I figured out what to do. Maybe I'd call a university or the Forestry Service, or find some way to profit from this discovery without losing control of it. Just a few days to think it through clearly. I had no idea that 50 years later, I'd still be standing outside that same door, having never made a single right decision about what I'd found. Those first few days turned into weeks before I even noticed time passing. The creature's broken leg needed to heal, I told myself. It would be cruel to release it injured, vulnerable to predators or starvation. I'd wait until it recovered, then figure out the right way to handle this. That justification carried me through the first month, then the second. Then I stopped counting. The initial violence was worse than I'd anticipated. When the tranquilizer wore off completely, the creature threw itself against the steel door with enough force to dent the metal. The sound echoed across my property, a rhythmic booming that I was terrified someone might hear. It vocalized constantly those first weeks, sounds that ranged from roars of rage to something that resembled sobbing. I couldn't sleep. Every night I'd lie in my house, a quarter mile from the bunker, listening to those distant cries and telling myself tomorrow I'd make a decision. I started bringing food, sliding it through a slot I'd cut in the door. Fresh salmon from the Eel River, berries I gathered from the property, vegetables from the grocery store in Eureka. At first, the creature wouldn't touch anything while I was near. I'd return hours later to find the food scattered, thrown against the walls in what seemed like defiance. But hunger is a powerful thing. By the third week, the food was being eaten. By the sixth week, the creature would approach the slot while I was there, taking offerings from my hand with surprising gentleness despite the hatred in its eyes. I started calling it Gray, though I never said the name aloud. The fur around its muzzle had a silver tint that became more pronounced as months turned into years. I told myself the name made it easier to track medical observations, to maintain the journal I'd started keeping. But really, the name was my attempt to create distance, to make this thing less human, more manageable in my mind. By 1976, something fundamental had shifted. Gray stopped trying to escape. The attempts just ceased entirely, replaced by a kind of resigned routine. It would eat when I brought food, retreat to the far corner when I needed to clean the bunker, respond to my voice with soft sounds that felt like acknowledgement rather than communication. I'd broken something in it, and that realization should have pushed me to act. Instead, it made me rationalize harder. It wouldn't survive out there now, I thought. 2 years in captivity had changed it, institutionalized it in ways I couldn't reverse. I built crude enrichment into the space, wooden platforms, objects it could manipulate, branches and stones I'd replace weekly. Gray would arrange them into patterns, stack the stones in careful towers, strip bark from branches with methodical precision. The intelligence was undeniable, and that made everything worse. This wasn't an animal adapting to captivity. This was a thinking being trying to maintain sanity in a concrete box. The years blurred together. 1977, 1978, 1979, my life contracted around the secret. I turned down invitations, avoided relationships, invented excuses for why no one could visit my property. The few friends I'd had drifted away. Women I dated sensed something off about me, some fundamental dishonesty they couldn't name, but refused to ignore. By 1982, I was completely alone except for Gray, and the irony wasn't lost on me that my only consistent companion was the creature I'd imprisoned. That same year, Gray became sick. I noticed it immediately when it stopped eating, when its breathing turned labored and wet. Pneumonia, maybe, or some infection I'd inadvertently introduced. I watched its condition deteriorate over 3 days, watched it lie motionless on the concrete floor, chest barely rising. And I faced a choice that revealed everything about who I'd become. I could let it die. The problem would solve itself. The secret would be buried. Or I could help, and in helping, commit myself even deeper to this monstrous situation I'd created. I helped. I called a veterinarian friend from my logging days, told him I had a sick bear in a trap on my property, needed advice on antibiotics. He talked me through dosages, warned me about infection risks. I spent $800 at a veterinary supply store in Reading, buying medications and equipment, offering vague explanations about livestock. I administered shots through the door slot, left water mixed with electrolytes, monitored temperature as best I could through observation. Gray recovered slowly over 2 weeks, and when its strength returned, when it could have resumed fighting or raging against captivity, it did something that broke my heart. It approached the door and made a soft sound, almost like gratitude. It had learned to depend on me completely. I was its captor, its torturer, and its only source of survival. The power dynamic was absolute, and I'd engineered it through neglect and cowardice. The mid-1980s brought small moments that felt like connection, but were really just trauma bonding. Gray began drawing in the dirt I'd spread on the floor for drainage, scratching shapes and patterns that seemed intentional. Circles within circles, lines radiating like sun rays, something that looked disturbingly like a crude map. It would show me these drawings when I brought food, pointing with one massive finger, as if trying to communicate something vital. I never understood. Or maybe I chose not to understand because understanding would require action. By 1989, I'd been Gray's warden for 15 years. 15 years of daily feedings, weekly cleanings, constant vigilance to maintain the secret. The creature had aged visibly, the silver spreading from its muzzle to its chest, movements becoming slower and more deliberate. It was middle-aged now, probably in its 30s if my estimates about its initial age were correct, and it had spent nearly half its life in a concrete box because of a decision I'd made in a moment of panic and greed. I sat outside the bunker one August evening that year, listening to Gray moving around inside, and did the math on my own life. I was 49 years old. I'd never married. I had no real friends. My work had become sporadic and unfocused. Every decision I made, every relationship I avoided, every opportunity I passed up, was governed by the need to maintain this secret. Gray wasn't the only prisoner. I'd locked myself in a cage of my own making, and I couldn't see any way out that didn't end in exposure, prosecution, and ruin. So I kept feeding it, kept cleaning the bunker, kept lying to myself that this was somehow sustainable, somehow justifiable. I'd become the entire world to something that deserved forests and family and freedom. And that knowledge sat in my chest like a stone, growing heavier with each passing year. Each meal delivered through a slot in a steel door. Each night spent alone in a house that felt more like a tomb than a home. The 1990s brought changes I couldn't control. In March of 1990, I was checking my fence line along the eastern border of my property when I noticed fresh wooden stakes driven into the ground, each one marked with orange tape and numbered tags, survey markers. Someone was measuring land, mapping boundaries, planning something that would bring attention to an area I'd spent 16 years keeping isolated. I drove into Eureka the next day and spent 3 hours at the county planning office, pretending to be a concerned landowner interested in local development. A board clerk pulled files and explained that the state was assessing a potential highway expansion, a new route that would cut through the coastal range and connect inland communities more directly to the coast. The preliminary surveys covered a 20-mile corridor. My property sat right in the middle of it. I started sleeping worse than I already did. Every car that passed on the distant main road felt like a threat. Every helicopter I heard, even miles away, seemed to be circling closer. Gray sensed my tension during feedings. It would watch me through the slot with those dark eyes, making soft, questioning sounds that I'd learned meant concern or confusion. After 16 years, we had a language of sorts, built on tone and repetition, and the grim intimacy of captor and captive. The first real close call came in July of 1991. I was working on the bunker's ventilation system, trying to improve airflow during the brutal summer heat, when I heard voices coming from the woods to the south. Young voices, laughing and talking too loud. Hikers, probably teenagers, definitely lost. They were heading directly toward my property. I left the bunker and intercepted them about 200 yards out, near the old logging road. 3 kids, maybe 16 or 17, with backpacks and a useless map. They asked if they were still on the Pacific Coast Trail. I told them no, that they were on private property, that they needed to leave immediately. When they hesitated, I let anger show in my voice, Told them I had every right to call the sheriff for trespassing. They left quickly, looking back at me like I was crazy. Maybe I was, but the encounter left me shaken. People were getting closer. The wilderness that had once felt endless was shrinking, carved up by trails and roads and the steady expansion of human activity. I started spending money I didn't really have on posted signs, better fencing, security measures that probably drew more attention than they prevented. Gray was changing too. By 1994, it had stopped eating for days at a time. Not sick, just disinterested. It would sit motionless in the corner for hours, staring at the concrete wall, barely acknowledging my presence during feedings. I recognized the signs from documentaries I'd seen about zoo animals. Depression, the kind that comes from absolute hopelessness, from a life with no variation, no purpose, no end in sight. I tried changing things, brought different foods, new objects to manipulate, even played a radio outside the door sometimes, thinking sound from the outside world might help. Nothing worked. Gray had given up on something fundamental, and I watched it happen with the sick understanding that I'd done this, that every day of captivity was another day of slow psychological death. Then the logging company came. It was September of 1995 when a man in a clean truck and expensive boots showed up at my house with a briefcase full of contracts. His company wanted to buy selective timber rights on my property. Not clear-cutting, he assured me, just sustainable harvesting of mature trees. He quoted numbers that made my head spin. $50,000 for access rights, with royalties on every board, foot harvested. It was more money than I'd seen in my entire life. I told him no. He looked confused, started explaining the offer again like I hadn't understood. I told him no again, more firmly. He left his card, said the offer would remain open, said most people in my position would jump at this kind of opportunity. After he drove away, I sat on my porch and understood how this looked. A man alone on 240 acres of valuable timber, refusing generous offers, acting hostile to any interest in his land. It looked like I was hiding something. Because I was. The rumors started after that. I heard them in town, snippets of conversation that would stop when people noticed me. Caldwell's running something illegal out there, maybe drugs, maybe stolen equipment. That weird hermit on the old logging road. Someone even suggested I was hiding toxic waste, dumping chemicals for companies that didn't want to pay for proper disposal. The truth was worse than any of their guesses, but the attention was becoming dangerous. In 1996, a kid named Travis Hawking, maybe 14 years old, was exploring the woods with his friends when he got separated from the group. He wandered onto my property and got close enough to the bunker to hear Gray vocalizing. I caught him standing there, frozen, listening to sounds he couldn't explain. I scared him badly, yelled at him to get out, told him if I caught him again, I'd have him arrested. He ran, but the damage was done. Within a week, half the teenagers in the county had heard about the weird sounds from crazy Caldwell's property. Most dismissed it as exaggeration or lies, but some believed, and believers talk. The stories grew with each telling. Strange screams in the night, inhuman roars. One kid claimed he'd seen glowing eyes through the trees, which was complete fiction. But fiction spreads faster than truth. The county sheriff, a man named Dale Pritchard, who I'd known casually for years, showed up in May of 1997. Friendly visit, he said, but his eyes scanned my property with professional attention. He'd gotten complaints about noise, about hostile behavior toward hikers, about general concerns from neighbors miles away who never used to care what I did. He asked to look around. I refused. He mentioned he could get a warrant if needed. I mentioned I knew my rights and hadn't broken any laws. We stared at each other for a long moment before he left, but I knew it wasn't over. I started keeping my journal more carefully after that, writing down everything in detail, hiding the notebooks in a fireproof safe I buried near the tree line. If something happened to me suddenly, if I died or got arrested, I wanted someone to eventually know the truth. Not for forgiveness. I was past deserving that. But for the record, for history, for whatever Gray's existence might mean to science or understanding. Then, in early 1998, I overheard something at a bar in Eureka that made my blood turn cold. Two men in suits were asking the bartender about local wildlife, about unusual sightings, about large primate reports in the region. They said they were researchers, but they didn't look like any researchers I'd ever seen. They looked military. They looked official. And they were asking questions that suggested they already knew some of the answers. I left the bar without finishing my drink and drove home in silence. 24 years I'd kept this secret, and now the walls were closing in from every direction. Surveyors and hikers and logging companies and curious teenagers and now government types asking about the exact thing I had locked in a concrete bunker on my property. I sat in my truck outside the bunker that night, listening to Gray moving around inside, and knew with absolute certainty that time was running out. The question wasn't if I'd be discovered. The question was when and by whom and what they'd do when they found out what I'd done. They came on a Tuesday morning in April of 1999. I was bringing Gray its breakfast when I heard vehicles on my access road, multiple engines moving in formation. I looked up to see 3 black SUVs with government plates rolling toward my house, kicking up dust that hung in the cool spring air. My stomach dropped. This wasn't the sheriff. This was something much worse. I left the food bucket and walked to meet them, trying to control the shaking in my hands. 6 people emerged from the vehicles, 4 men in dark suits and 2 others in what looked like tactical gear. The lead figure was a woman, mid-40s, with steel-gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that missed nothing. She approached with a leather folder tucked under her arm. "Robert Caldwell?" she asked, though she clearly already knew the answer. "I'm Dr. Sarah Vance. We need to talk about the thermal signature we've detected on your property." She didn't introduce the others. Didn't say what agency she represented. Just stood there waiting for me to respond. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, the lie automatic after 25 years of practice. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. She opened the folder and showed me a satellite image of my property, date stamped from 6 weeks earlier. There was a heat bloom marked in red, centered exactly where the bunker sat. "Enhanced thermal imaging," she explained, taken during a routine survey of the region. "Standard procedure for land assessment. Except this signature was unusual. Too large for local wildlife, too consistent in location, too regular in pattern. It stays in one place," she said quietly. "Every scan we've run over the past 3 months shows the same thing. A large mammalian heat signature that never moves more than a few meters. Now, Mr. Caldwell, would you like to tell me what you're keeping in that structure, or should we proceed with a federal warrant?" I felt the ground drop out from under me. 25 years of secrets ending in a single moment. I could deny everything, force them to get warrants and lawyers and make this a long fight. Or I could cooperate, and maybe retain some small measure of control. I looked at the tactical personnel, at the equipment cases they were already unloading from the vehicles, and understood I'd already lost. "I need guarantees," I said. "I need to know what happens to me, What happens to it before I show you anything?" Dr. Vance nodded as if she'd expected this. She explained that I had two options: cooperate fully, sign non-disclosure agreements, accept compensation for my property's use as a research site, and face no prosecution, or refuse and face federal charges she rattled off with casual precision: unlawful containment of an endangered species, obstruction of scientific research, violation of wildlife protection statutes I'd never heard of. She made it clear these weren't threats, they were facts. I took them to the bunker. The walk across my property felt like a death march. When I unlocked the steel door, the smell hit them first. 25 years of captivity, despite my cleaning efforts, had created an odor that was unmistakable. Animal and human and something else, the scent of long despair. Dr. Vance pulled out a flashlight and shined it inside. Gray was in the far corner, hunched and still. When the light hit it, it turned its head slowly, and I heard one of the men behind me let out a sharp breath. "My God," Dr. Vance whispered. It was the first crack I'd seen in her professional demeanor. She turned to the others. "Start containment protocols. I want a full medical team here within 2 hours. Treat this as a priority 1, biological recovery." She looked at me with something that might have been disgust or pity. "How long has it been in there?" 25 years, I said. The number hung in the air like an accusation. One of the tactical guys actually stepped back, his face showing open revulsion. But Dr. Vance just nodded, already making notes on a tablet one of her team had handed her. Within 48 hours, my property had been transformed into something I barely recognized. Military personnel arrived in unmarked vehicles. Medical equipment, monitoring systems, and portable laboratory units filled what had been my workshop. They set up a command center in my own house, turning my living room into an operations hub with computers and communications equipment. I was given a room in what had been my own home, told to stay available for consultation, handed papers to sign that I barely read. They examined Gray with clinical efficiency: blood samples, tissue biopsies, dental impressions, full body scans with portable equipment I'd never seen before. I watched through a new observation window they'd installed, watched Gray endure all of it with that same resigned stillness it had developed over the years. The medical team talked in hushed voices about muscle atrophy, vitamin deficiencies, psychological trauma indicators that matched long-term isolation in primates. But what horrified me most was how quickly they adapted to Gray's existence. There was no wonder, no amazement at discovering proof of a species science claimed didn't exist. Just procedures, protocols, documentation. They'd done this before, I was certain of it. This wasn't first contact. This was recovery of a known asset. Gray's condition got worse under the new routine. The constant examinations, the bright lights, the new faces and hands and procedures broke something that had barely been holding together. It stopped eating entirely, would sit motionless for hours, unresponsive even to stimuli that should have provoked reaction. I watched its eyes go dull, watched the life drain out of it day by day. 3 weeks after they arrived, I was in the observation room when Gray looked directly at me during an examination. The medical team was taking spinal fluid samples, a procedure that clearly caused pain. Gray's eyes found mine through the window, and in that moment I saw something I'd never seen before. Not fear, not resignation, betrayal, pure, absolute betrayal. It understood, maybe for the first time, that I had been the architect of all of this, that every moment of its captivity traced back to my choice on that July day in 1974. I left the room and threw up in the bushes outside. When I came back, Dr. Vance was waiting. "You kept it alive for 25 years," she said. "That's actually impressive given the conditions. Most specimens don't survive more than a few years in captivity." The way she said specimens, plural, confirmed what I'd suspected. "We're considering transport to a secure facility in Colorado. Better equipment, more controlled environment. You'd be compensated for your cooperation." "Of course. What happens to me?" I asked. She looked at me like I'd asked a stupid question. "You stay here, you consult as needed, you keep your mouth shut. You signed an NDA that carries a 20-year federal prison sentence if violated. You live your life, Mr. Caldwell, and you never speak of this again." She paused. "You should be grateful. What you did to this creature, keeping it in these conditions, you should be in prison. But you're useful to us as a cooperating witness, so you get to stay free." "Free?" I almost laughed. I watched through the window as they sedated Gray for another round of tests, watched its massive body go limp on the examination table, and understood that I'd never been free since that day in 1974. I'd built my own prison alongside Gray's, and now the walls were just more official. The bars just more legitimate. The military hadn't rescued Gray. They'd just upgraded its cage, and they'd made me a paid accomplice to whatever came next. The years after 1999 blurred into a routine that was somehow worse than the isolation I'd known before. I was kept on site as what Dr. Vance called a historical consultant, which really meant I was a controlled witness who knew too much to release but too useful to eliminate. They paid me $3,000 a month, deposited into an account I rarely touched. The money felt like blood payment, compensation for selling out the last shred of my conscience. They upgraded the bunker significantly over the first year, reinforced the walls, installed proper ventilation and climate control, added observation cameras and medical monitoring equipment. It stopped being a crude prison and became a laboratory. Gray lived in the same 12 by 12 space, but now it was measured and documented and scientifically optimized for long-term captivity. Somehow, that made it worse. Personnel rotated every 6 months. New faces, new procedures, but the same clinical detachment. They'd take measurements, run tests, collect samples. I was required to be present during some examinations because Gray responded to my voice with slightly less resistance than it showed strangers. The creature that had once shown intelligence and tried to communicate now just endured, existing in a state somewhere between life and catatonia. By 2006, Gray's fur had turned almost completely silver. It moved like something decades older than it should have been. Joints stiff, movements slow and painful. The medical reports I sometimes glimpsed talked about accelerated aging, stress-induced cellular damage, metabolic disruption. In technical language, they were documenting how captivity was killing it by degrees. Then, in March of 2008, they brought in another one. I was in my house when I heard the commotion. Multiple vehicles arriving at odd hours. Unusual activity around a newly constructed secondary containment unit they'd built the year before. When I went to investigate, Dr. Vance, who still oversaw operations despite the rotating staff, stopped me at the perimeter. "We've acquired a second specimen," she said flatly. "Female, elderly, captured in northern Idaho. She's in poor condition but stable." Something in her tone suggested I shouldn't ask more questions, but I did anyway. "How did you catch her?" "Dr. Fee." Vance looked at me with eyes that had gone cold over the years. "The same way you caught yours, Mr. Caldwell. Opportunity and tranquilizers. We've been tracking population clusters for decades." They let me observe from a distance. The new Bigfoot was smaller than Gray, maybe 6.5 feet tall, with reddish-brown fur that had faded to a dusty copper color. She was old, that was obvious, and terrified in a way that Gray had long since moved past. She fought the containment, vocalized constantly, refused food. I watched the staff follow their protocols with the same efficiency they'd shown with Gray. She died 6 months later. I wasn't told officially, but I saw them remove something large in a black containment bag, saw the increased activity and hushed conversations. Later that week, a maintenance worker I'd befriended, a young guy named Marcus, who seemed troubled by what he saw here, confirmed it. Heart failure, he said. Stress-induced cardiac arrest. They'd harvested what they needed first. Tissue samples, organ biopsies, full skeletal x-rays. Then, they disposed of the remains at some facility he wasn't cleared to know about. That death broke something in me that had been cracking for years. I started really looking at what was happening here. Stopped hiding behind the justifications and the paycheck. This wasn't research. This was systematic extinction through captivity. They were finding the last remnants of a species and locking them away until they died, collecting data while erasing the living creatures themselves. I began keeping detailed records again, but secretly this time. I'd learned where the camera blind spots were, when the staff rotations left gaps in surveillance. I started documenting everything with a small digital camera I'd bought in town. Photos of Gray's deteriorating condition, shots of medical reports left carelessly on desks, videos of procedures that seemed more like torture than science. In 2015, new personnel arrived, younger than the usual rotation, less careful about what they discussed within earshot. I overheard a conversation between two of them outside the observation room. They were talking about termination protocols, about tissue preservation procedures, about what would happen when Gray became, as they put it, non-viable for continued study. They were planning for its death, had procedures ready for when captivity finally finished what I'd started 31 years earlier. I contacted Marcus, who'd quit the program 2 years earlier but still lived in the area. He'd been haunted by what he'd seen, had tried reporting it through official channels, and been shut down with threats similar to what I'd received. We met at a truck stop halfway to Reading, and I showed him what I'd collected. His face went pale looking through the photos. "We need to get this out," he said. "Media, wildlife organizations, somebody who can't be threatened into silence." But I knew it wasn't that simple. The NDAs, the federal oversight, the agencies involved that still wouldn't identify themselves officially. Any leak would be traced back to me immediately. I'd go to prison, and Gray would die anyway, probably faster, once I wasn't there to advocate for even the minimal care it received. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 changed things in unexpected ways. The facility reduced to skeleton crews, essential personnel only. Suddenly, there were days when only 2 or 3 people were on site, sometimes just one overnight supervisor. I had more access than I'd had in years, more freedom to move around my own property without constant surveillance. I started planning seriously in 2022. I was 82 years old, had maybe a few good years left if I was lucky. Gray was approaching 50 years of captivity, visibly dying, clearly suffering. The math was simple and terrible. If I did nothing, it would die in that bunker, and its body would become another specimen for preservation and study. If I acted, I might give it a few days of freedom before the end, and I would certainly go to prison for whatever time I had left. I chose action. I reached out to Marcus again, asked him to help me gather supplies. Veterinary sedatives, medical equipment, documentation materials. I told him I was planning to release Gray and that I needed insurance in case something happened to me. I gave him copies of everything I documented over the years, told him to distribute it to specific wildlife organizations and journalists if I was arrested or disappeared. By late 2023, I had everything ready. Sedatives calculated for Gray's current weight, bolt cutters for the upgraded security fence they'd installed, detailed maps of patrol patterns and camera placements. I'd learned the gaps in their security, the times when attention was lowest. I knew I'd get one chance, maybe an hour or two before alarms were triggered and pursuit began. I spent those final months visiting Gray more frequently, talking to it through the observation window when no one else was around. I don't know if it understood anything I said after so many years of deterioration, but I said it anyway. Apologies for what I'd done. Promises for what I was about to try. Acknowledgments that freedom now might just mean a different kind of death. The creature would look at me sometimes with those clouded eyes, and I'd wonder if any recognition remained, if it remembered the younger version of both of us from that day in 1974 when everything went wrong. I was ready. The supplies were hidden, the plan memorized, the distribution network for documentation in place. I just needed the right moment, the right gap in their schedule. And I needed to accept that this final act wouldn't be redemption. You don't get redemption for 50 years of cruelty, but maybe it could be acknowledgement. An admission that Gray deserved better than what I'd given it, better than what we'd all given it. Maybe that would have to be enough. The moment came on February 17, 2024, a Saturday night when the on-site staff had been reduced to a single overnight supervisor, a man named Chen, who I knew spent most of his shifts watching movies on his tablet in the command center. A winter storm was moving through, rain and wind that would cover sound and discourage any unexpected visits. It was now or never. I waited until midnight, then moved. The bolt cutters made quick work of the perimeter fence at a spot I'd identified months earlier, hidden from the main cameras by an equipment shed. I crossed the compound in darkness, rain soaking through my jacket. My heart pounding so hard, I thought it might give out before I reached the bunker. The sedatives for Chen were in a thermos of coffee I'd prepared, left in the command center earlier that evening with a friendly note. By now, he'd be unconscious, not harmed, but deeply asleep for the next 6 hours. The bunker's electronic lock had a manual override, installed years ago as a safety measure. I'd watched them use it during drills, memorize the code. My hands shook as I entered the numbers, half expecting alarms that never came. The lock clicked open. I pulled the heavy door wide and stepped inside for the first time in over a decade. Gray was in the corner, barely visible in the dim emergency lighting. When the door opened, it didn't move, didn't react. Just sat there like it had sat for 50 years, waiting for nothing because nothing ever changed. "Gray," I said softly. "It's time to go. We're leaving." The creature lifted its head slowly, and I saw how much it had deteriorated since I'd last been this close. Its eyes were clouded with cataracts, fur matted and thin in patches, breathing labored and wet. It looked at me without recognition, without hope, just the blank stare of something that had forgotten what hope meant. I approached slowly, talking the whole time, keeping my voice gentle. I had food, fresh salmon that I placed on the floor between us. Gray looked at it, but didn't move. I waited, patient despite the screaming urgency in my head. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably 5 minutes, Gray reached out and took the fish. It ate slowly, mechanically, and I used that time to attach a soft rope to its arm. Not restraining, but guiding. "Come on," I said, tugging gently. "Outside. Trees. Remember trees?" I didn't know if it remembered anything, but I had to try. Gray stood, movements stiff and painful, joints that hadn't been used properly in half a century, protesting every motion. We walked to the door together, me leading, Gray following with shuffling steps that broke my heart. The rain hit us as we emerged, and something changed. Gray stopped, lifted its face to the sky, let the water run over its fur. Its mouth opened slightly, tasting air that wasn't recycled and filtered. A sound came from deep in its chest, not quite a vocalization, more like a long exhale of something that might have been relief. We made it to the tree line before Gray's legs gave out. It collapsed against a massive redwood, sliding down to sit with its back against the bark. I sat beside it, both of us soaked, both of us breathing hard. Behind us, I knew the alarms would trigger soon, that Chen would wake or a backup system would notice the breach. We had minutes, maybe an hour if I was lucky. Gray's hand reached out and touched the tree trunk, fingers spreading across the rough bark. It made a soft sound, almost like crying, and pressed its face against the wood. 50 years since it had touched a living tree, felt actual earth beneath it, breathed unfiltered forest air. I watched it, experienced these simple things like they were miracles, and understood the magnitude of what I'd stolen. We stayed in the forest for 3 days. I'd brought supplies, water and food and blankets, and we camped in a small clearing 2 miles from my property. Gray moved very little, mostly sat against trees or lay on the soft forest floor, touching moss and leaves and fallen branches with something like wonder. It ate when I offered food, but mostly just existed in the space, breathing it in, letting the world it had been torn from slowly seep back into its awareness. On the 3rd night, Gray died. No violence, no struggle, just a gradual slowing of breath until it stopped entirely. I was sitting beside it, my hand on its massive shoulder, when I felt the last exhale. The creature's eyes, clouded as they were, seemed to look past me toward the canopy above, toward stars it hadn't seen in 50 years. Then it was gone. I buried the body deep, in a spot I'll never reveal, under redwoods that will stand for centuries. I used rocks to mark the grave in a way only I would recognize, and I said words that felt inadequate for the magnitude of what I was acknowledging. 50 years of captivity ended in 3 days of freedom. It wasn't justice, it wasn't redemption, it was just the only ending I could give. I walked back to my property as dawn broke. Military vehicles were already there, agents searching the compound. They found me within minutes, and I didn't resist. I'd already triggered the distribution of my documentation. Emails sent on a timer to journalists and wildlife organizations. Packages mailed to researchers and advocacy groups. Photos, videos, medical reports. My full confession written out in detail. They arrested me, charged me with a list of federal violations that would keep me in court for years. But some of the documentation made it out, leaked despite their best efforts at containment. Blurred photos appeared online. Redacted documents showed up on cryptozoology forums. My confession was posted anonymously to multiple sites. Mainstream media dismissed most of it as conspiracy theory, elaborate hoaxes, the ravings of a disturbed old man. But some people believed. Some people started asking questions that couldn't be fully answered. I'm speaking now from a location I can't disclose, under house arrest, while the legal process moves forward. They've offered me deals, threatened me with life in prison, tried everything to get me to recant or reveal where I buried Gray. I've refused all of it. The documentation is out there. People can investigate, can dig, can demand answers from agencies that won't even acknowledge what they were doing. What I know, what I can confirm, is that Gray wasn't the only one. The facility in Colorado that Dr. Vance mentioned, the casual way they handled procedures for creature science claims doesn't exist. The female they brought in from Idaho. They've been doing this for decades, capturing and studying Bigfoot, while the world pretends they're just folklore. How many are left in the wild? How many are in captivity right now? I don't have those answers. What I have is guilt that will follow me to my grave. 50 years, I kept Gray in a concrete box because I was too much of a coward to make the right choice in 1974. 25 more years I watched the military continue what I started, turning cruelty into science, extinction into data collection. 3 days I gave it freedom before death took what captivity had already destroyed. I look toward the forest sometimes, toward the mountains where Gray is buried, and I wonder if there are others out there, others still free, still hidden, still surviving despite everything we've done to eliminate them. I hope there are. I hope they stay hidden better than Gray did, that they never trust a human the way that young creature trusted me enough to take an apple from my hand before I betrayed that trust completely. This isn't a confession seeking forgiveness, this is a warning. They exist, the government knows, and they're willing to let an entire species disappear into secret facilities rather than admit the truth. Gray deserved forests and family and a life I can't even imagine. Instead, it got me and a concrete box and 50 years of suffering that ended only in death. That's the truth. Do with it what you will.